Okay, I want to thank everybody for allowing me to talk to you a little bit today about some conservation opportunities with precision agriculture in our field. I'll get this mouse to work. Okay, so for some of you might not know exactly what precision agriculture is, and it's got a lot of definitions. There's about 14 of them floating around the literature. And there's one from Wheeler McBradney's publication in 2000 that I think is probably the best, and it talks about a philosophical shift in management and how we manage the variability of agriculture in the industry, focusing on two things: profitability and or environmental impact. And what the approach I'm going to show you to this technology that we've been using for about a decade now is really just a marriage of those two things: environmental impact and profitability. And when you take a 30,000 foot view of kind of the precision ag model and how it kind of fits into the agriculture industry, it's this kind of enormous undertaking of tools and technologies, from everything from yield mapping and GPS sensors and precision irrigation, satellite technology. It's a lot of different moving pieces that fit into this iterative loop to essentially make sure we can quantify variability and manage agricultural inputs and outputs in the most cost-effective and productive way. But a simpler way to think about it is a great quote from Pearson Noack in 1999 that essentially refers to precision agriculture as just doing the right thing at the right place, the right time, and the right way. So when I give talks on this topic, I typically focus on precision ag is nothing more than farming smarter, right? Using technology to farm smarter. And when we do that, it helps the farmer, and we're going to describe how we can actually make it help the farmer and help ecosystem services and ag landscapes. As a branch of precision agriculture, there has developed a field in the last 15 or so years called precision conservation. And precision conservation is defined as using kind of the same tools and technologies of precision ag, but to implement conservation management practices that take into account that variability. So essentially using the same technology, but with a conservation context more implicit. And this was a book that was published a couple years ago that we were fortunate enough to have a chapter in, where it kind of outlines multiple steps and tools that you can use to take precision ag technology and using in a natural resource conservation framework. So when you think about precision agriculture, like I said, it's site-specific data, everything from the soils to the topography, to the inputs, to the yield, to the terrain, to the output of the vegetation. It's all these different layers building upon each other. And with that comes, at each layer, there's an opportunity to implement conservation in one way or another, either by reducing inputs or by strategically applying inputs a certain way, or by changing essentially the nature of how we farm certain landscapes or how we farm actually certain parts of a field. And what I'm going to discuss to you today is mostly about how we do with in-field management using this technology. So like I said, a lot of different tools, satellites, GPS units, moisture sensors, all kinds of things. The most popular part of all the tools in precision ag, the most popular technology right now is the yield mapping, and it varies by how popular it is, but the things you typically hear about are variable rate technology, but all these things are integrated into these systems, and farmers now, you really can't buy a tractor or a combine for that matter that doesn't come now ready to implement this technology. And as a result, this is not your grandfather's tractor anymore. These tractors come with touch screens and multiple every bell and whistle you can think of. So when you're sitting in the cab of a tractor nowadays, whereas even not long ago when I was farming, you were lucky if you had a cab or a radio. Now you're watching yield measurements as you go through the field. You're seeing how you're cutting, and it's mapped very geospatially in a really interesting way. So yield mapping, like I said, is the most popular technology. What it does is it's a simple process, but it's got these sensors built into the combine, and essentially as it's going through the field, it's quantifying a spatially explicit yield, bushels per acre or pounds per acre, whatever your unit of metric is, and then it maps that distribution across the field in a spatially explicit manner, so we can see which parts of fields are not cutting a lot of yield or which parts of fields are cutting a great deal of yield. And we can use that information to make very field-specific prescriptions for either inputs or other issues. And when you look at the adoption of yield mapping, this is the latest data from USDA. This is from 2000 up to 2016. In 2016, for corn especially, it was just over almost 45% of the planted acres were adopting this technology. Now, there's a difference in adopting and using it to make decisions. Adoption and application are two different things that we can have a discussion about at another time. The technology's there. It's coming standard on the equipment now, and I assume when the next survey comes out with these numbers, these trends will have increased. So let's talk about how this technology can influence conservation. Let's zoom out on an agricultural landscape, kind of take the 30,000-foot view and look at the modern agricultural landscape in North America. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I've got to get through this just to make sure we're all on the same page. We have lots of conservation concerns, right? Things like erosion, flooding, non-point source pollution, sedimentation, all kinds of things that we're dealing with in the agricultural landscape. Pollinator issues, net beneficial insects, lots of declines there, a lot of it associated with the agricultural landscape, also neonicotinoids and pesticide use and all these different variables. But at the end of the day, the driving factor behind, arthropod decreases in agricultural landscapes is generally, the general consensus is, it's a lack of semi-natural plant habitat, non-crop plant communities that these critters can use. And let's think about CRP for a moment. We've lost a lot of CRP over the last several years due to changes in the farm bill, changes in the commodity markets. And we lost about 13 million acres just between 2007 and 2016 alone. And some of that was concentrated in some really important areas, especially for pollinators and certain bird species. Take a look at the prairie poplar region there, take a look at parts of Iowa, and think about ducks, monarchs, bobwhites, grassland birds, butterflies. These are really important areas. And a lot of that was due to timing of contract expiration, but it was also due to changes in commodity prices. If you look at just 2020 alone, just this year alone, we're set to lose right around 4.5 million acres are set to expire of CRP contracts, right? And the question becomes, when landowners are faced with either renewing their contract or not, the question becomes, is it more financial to re-enroll this land, or is it more financially beneficial to not re-enroll this land? And there's some challenges and conservation concerns that farmers face to deal with this. We've also got issues with fragmentation and all the associated issues with multiple species, especially area-sensitive species and species that are sensitive to fragmentation. And then you think about other conservation concerns about how we implement conservation on the landscape. This was a brilliant publication from John Geiser and James Martin and Richard Chandler and some others at UGA, where they looked at the crepe landscape in Kentucky and looked at the importance of how close some of these crepe contracts were, these native grass contracts were to each other for different species. And the take-home message here was, for bobwhite especially, the distance between these one patch to the other was really important for if it was going to its utility to a local bobwhite population, because things like bobwhite aren't very as good at dispersing, say, as something like a dick thistle, right? So dick thistles, you can put contracts here, there. Dick thistles are going to find it. Bobwhites are not. So it really brings into question where and how we allocate different conservation efforts in a landscape by species. And then we think about the land sharing versus land sparing debate. This is a really interesting publication from POC-B a few years ago. And what it's showing is across the spectrum, moving from left to right across the stream, A through C, different approaches to land sharing and then moving into land sparing at different levels. And I would contend that neither of these is easy to accomplish in an agricultural landscape. But as you move from left to right, it gets increasingly better for most species as you move towards C, right? For most species, having those aggregations of larger landscapes that are in some type of non-crop habitat is generally better. But it's actually really challenging to do C. It's also really challenging to do A, and it's really challenging to do B. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is another approach we can take to try to get as close to one of these as possible, knowing that it gets better as you move towards C, but C is really hard to accomplish in the modern agricultural landscape. So those are some of the conservation concerns. We've also got some economic concerns that this technology can help us address. So crop production prices have gone up incredibly fast in the last several years. They've gone down a little bit, but not at the same rate as crop prices have dropped. So it costs more to farm an acre of corn or soybeans than it did, say, not too long ago. And that the input cost has actually kind of stagnated for a while. Similarly, commodity prices, which were rocket high 2011, 2012, when I was really getting into publishing some of this first research we did, and that was great for farmers, but they've dropped considerably. And corn sits around $3 to $4 right now, and soybeans sitting around $9 per bushel. And that's quite a contrast to just a few years ago when it was at 13, 14, sometimes $16 a bushel. So right now you've got increased input costs and lower prices for commodity crops. So the profit margin has been condensed in the modern agricultural landscape. And we've seen that through another number of data sets where the break-even point for corn and soybean profitability has gone down, and as you see, U.S. CRP acreage has gone down with that. So we have a situation where we've got opportunities for increasing conservation, but we've got these economic concerns that farmers have to deal with, not only including not every acre of a field is the same profitability or the same yield for that matter. Low yield, typically it equals low profitability, but not always. It really depends on how much money you've got invested in that acre. But as a general rule, you're typically not making a lot of money if you have a low yielding area. We see that relationship kind of separate a little bit when you have really high yielding areas. Those areas required a lot more inputs. The profit margin could be shrinking. So what we try to tell farmers to do is farm for profit, not for yield, and make sure you understand the profitability of your field. And here's a hypothetical example from a consultant friend of mine that gave me this slide. If you think about a field, and this is, like I said, hypothetical, 4 different zones, right, where the field's different variable production. But overall, the field may be profitable, maybe $150 an acre in profit, which is, most farmers are at least trying to get over, $100 per acre in profit. But it may be really good in some areas. You're just booming at $300 per acre, but you may actually be losing money in some parts of the field. When you average it out, it's profitable, but there are these red areas that you're losing money on. And that's what we use this technology to identify, because we want to make sure we're allocating resources, time and energy, and using with that part of the field that may be losing money financially from the crop production scenario, if there's other opportunities to make money off of it. Some other economic concerns that farmers are dealing with is looking at why they enroll in conservation programs. Right? This was a really cool study published out of South Dakota, where they looked at the motivations to enroll in the CREP program in the James River Basin of South Dakota. And what they found was the number one reason was financial incentives. Interestingly, and this is fairly a newer trend we're seeing, the second highest rated was wildlife and fish populations, right? So we're seeing this increased interest in conservation, but financial decisions really are what drives conservation, agricultural production decisions. So farmers need to make money off this. This is some USDA data that looked at the percentage of program participants across a suite of practices within CRP that would not have enrolled in the practice without the conservation payment. Right? So you'll look at things like filter strips, riparian buffers, field buffers, grass waterways, things that are really, really, really popular programs and really, really good for a lot of different wildlife species. 90+% would not have enrolled without the financial incentive. So it's not that farmers don't want to make good conservation decisions. I've rarely met a farmer who didn't want the best for his land. It's that they're economically hindered by finances. So we need the financial incentives to actually give them the opportunity to help them make some of these better decisions. Another research on this showed that, this is from Nebraska, showed that one of the economic factors, which was crop production being more profitable in CRP, was the rank as the highest reason not to enroll in CRP. So if you're making $200 an acre off an edge part of a field, and you're maybe $80 an acre from CRP payment, that wouldn't be a part of the field that I would recommend someone enroll. But we've got to be able to map that spatially and understand the trade-offs between where we can make money off conservation and where we can't make money off conservation, right? So we don't want to encourage landowners to enroll and to take profitable agricultural land out of production if they're making a lot of money off of it. And then the last slide I think I've got on this topic was publication from Lily Swiker and Barry Gigliotto from South Dakota. And they talked about how Farm Bill conservation programs, it's not so much that they enroll for the payment, it's that they can't enroll without the payment, right? They said the financial compensation makes it possible for landowners to conserve natural resources in agricultural lands. And so I've given you economic concerns, I've given you conservation concerns. Let's talk about some of the opportunities. The conservation opportunities in the Farm Bill are vast, right? And we as a profession, we've largely well documented these. We've got 30+ practices under CRP alone. And I'm going to focus on CRP on this talk, that's where most of my research falls. 30 some odd practices alone that address a myriad of issues in conservation, water quality, wildlife habitat, pollinators, everything you can think of. And you can fit these different practices all over the landscape. In an average farm, you can fit multiple practices, and it's really diverse options you can actually to increase conservation opportunities on your field. What we haven't done as good of a job in I think in our profession is illustrating the economic opportunities of the Farm Bill conservation programs. And that's because we haven't had the ability until recent to actually compare the economic opportunities of farming directly to the economic opportunities of conservation enrollment, right? And now we have that technology, and then we can do that. So just to wrap up this area, we've talked about the conservation concerns in the agricultural landscape. They're fairly vast. Most of us are familiar with them or are working directly with them. We've also talked about some of the conservation opportunities, and there's some overlap there. There's a lot of things we can address. We've also talked about the economic concerns that farmers are facing, and then we've talked about some of the economic opportunities. And the point I'm going to try to make in this talk is that precision agriculture is where the overlap of all four of these issues come together, and we can use precision agriculture to identify conservation opportunities and where they overlap with economic opportunities. And when we find that balance, we can have farmers use conservation as an economic tool to increase profitability on their farm. So you may be asking, how can this technology influence conservation, right? We're talking about yield maps and things like that. Well, there's a relationship with yield and the conservation concerns, right? This is a great publication by David Muth several years ago that talked about the areas of the field that typically have the most issues with erosion, like, you know, the slope is bad, the soil's poor, sandy soils, that kind of thing. There's low organic matter. Those things are often the ones that show the least yield. And that's what we're seeing here. The areas that have the most conservation concerns or typically have lower yield, and those areas, zooming into that part of the field, typically have issues like nitrogen leaching or more erosion challenges, right? There's a relationship to that. If it's low yielding, it doesn't grow good crops, there's a reason for it, right? And what we found is the areas that are low yielding often have the most opportunity to increase economic return. For example, if you remove those areas from farming alone, just don't farm them, you got no inputs in them, you can actually increase the field's profitability, or you can actually perhaps enroll them in a conservation practice. So how else can this technology be used to identify economic opportunities? This was a publication in Scientific Reports last year, I believe, and they looked across the upper Midwest and found that using remote sensing and a variety of really cool analytical models to map yield variability at a large scale, what they found was across this geography you see in panel A there, 26% of the subfield regions were classified as stable low yield. That means they are low yield year after year. So I just showed you what David Muth showed, that those are usually areas that erosion, nitrogen leaching, all kinds of conservation issues, sedimentation, blah, 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 blah. But they're also low yield. 28% of those were classified as unstable low yield, which means some years they were low yield, some years they were not low yield. But if we just go with 26% alone, imagine if we targeted 26% of that landscape you see in panel A for some type of different land use other than cropping. Imagine the conservation potential that exists there, because those low yield areas are almost guaranteed to be low profitability. And if the farmer's not making money, it's probably some opportunities we can use there. So we can take all the different spatial requirements of all the conservation practices we've got, we can build them into a decision model using the precision ag technology. So we can say, okay, certain practices are eligible here, certain practices are eligible there, and we can find a way to link the economic opportunities and the conservation opportunities spatially in one program and identify that overlap so we can target that. And at Mississippi State, we've done this. We've built a decision support tool called the Mississippi State Precision Conservation Tool. And what it does is it allows farmers, if they have yield data, to directly compare the conservation options that are profitable on their farm to the direct farm, their own data, which is their yield data, which is their farming profitability, and make a direct comparison and say, am I going to make more financially beneficial to take certain parts of this field out of production and enroll in conservation? So the way it works, it's a GUI. You know, you've got all the conservation practices built into the Farm Bill that are in the Farm CRP. You pick which ones you want, and it has built behind the code all the spatial eligibility, all the economic differences, all the Farm Bill language is kind of built into the back of this code. And you walk through and it puts an input data, you put the soil type in, you put all the county in, it calculates your soil rental rate. And if we were doing like CP33, which is this example for bobwhite buffers, and we've got yield data, we can actually do a direct comparison in field. I'm gonna walk you through it. But the first thing it does is that before you run the yield data, it'll tell you where all your conservation opportunities are. So for example, this is a farm in Lowndes County, Mississippi. We wanted to see where CP22, forest and riparian buffers, everywhere it was eligible based off the Farm Bill eligibility requirements of CP22, which are certain distance from streams and wetlands. And we took this farm, we had some inputs, and it showed us, you know, there were several hundred acres of CP22 opportunity, everywhere CP22 was eligible. Now, We did the same thing on this farm for CP33, the fields they were interested in, and it was several hundred acres of CP33 that was eligible around the field borders. Now, I would never recommend a landowner enroll everything. As great as that would be to me as a quail biologist, I want the landowner to make money. So now I said, look, this is where conservation opportunities. Now let's talk about where conservation opportunities that overlap with economic opportunities. So we put some new buttons. We pull it in the yield data, which the farmer gives us. We put in some information about the commodity price they want to simulate or whatever they sold that year, or if they want to estimate what they think they're going to get next year. Input cost, you build all the economics into the model. I'm going to walk you through a scenario. So you get a yield file. It's a bunch of points. It goes through a cleaning process, and it's just yield, bushels per acre. This was a cornfield, I'm guessing. Right, so we've got to make that into a surface. So we take the economic data the farmer gives us, and we generate a profit surface. Now we're not talking about yield anymore. We're talking about revenue. So red areas are where the farmer is losing money. Green and yellow areas are where the farmer is making money. And this is a big difference. This tells a farmer, hey, you're losing money in this area for a variety of reasons: competition from the adjacent plant community, compaction, browse, whatever it is. We just know that you're losing money in these areas, and we want you to be able to find an opportunity to solve that. So what we can do is, if this farmer wanted to enroll in CP33, we can simulate different buffer widths around the property. We know the soil type. We know what USDA is going to pay that farmer to take that land out of production and enroll in that program with the financial incentives. It's all built in there. And then we can generate a new profit surface that illustrates how profitability now changes when you remove unprofitable land and add conservation practice. So, for example, CP33, if you add a 30-foot buffer of CP33, I think this probably was $70-something per acre or whatever, you no longer have those input costs associated with that. You've got the input costs associated with CP33, which is built into the model. The farmer can change that if he wants it, and it gives you a new profit surface. So that's a 30-foot buffer. If you do a 120-foot buffer, you notice we've gotten rid of most of the red, but we've also gotten rid of some of the green, right? And this is an example where I typically don't want a farmer to enroll the maximum amount that is eligible for the practice, because he may actually be cutting into some really profitable ground that he's going to make more money off farming corn and soybeans. So after you run that scenario, the tool outputs the PDF, pops up on the screen, and it shows you a direct comparison in dollars per acre between the red bar, which is the original profit per acre of farming the field, and then the green bar, which is the profitability under the CRP scenarios, right? And it gives you a direct comparison. Now the landowner can say, man, that's a no-brainer, or if it's a little less, man, it's just not enough return for me. They can make an informed decision about the economic outcomes of a conservation decision. But we also don't want to be limited to, with CP33, you know, the issue with the buffer, uniform buffer. Maybe the whole field doesn't have to be buffer. Maybe you just want to identify only the areas that are definitely going to make more money. So we built that into the tool as well. So it's got a little button, you click on it, and then for CP33, and it'll actually tell you, hey, here are all the areas, the cells in that field where the payment for CP33 would exceed what the profit per acre is based off the data the farmer gave us. And then it runs a smoothing algorithm and aggregates them. Now, I would never want a landowner to enroll this very convoluted, irregular edge, because that would be a lot of turning of the tractor, and no one would enjoy that. But it gives the landowner the opportunity to say, hey, let me pick and choose what I want here. So then we built some functionality in the tool where he can actually draw his own buffer scenario using the guide, which is what we just showed, is where it's more profitable. So he can say, oh, I want to enroll this, or maybe I want to enroll that, or maybe I don't. But it gives the landowner the ability to design within the confines of the program eligibility where they want to take land out of production and create their own user-defined conservation scenario to make sure they're increasing their profitability. And then if you do that strategically, you get the buffers only where you want them, you end up with this very uniform, very, very homogeneous profit map. Right? And this is what farmers are looking for. They want to have consistent profit across the spatial boundaries of the farm. And when you target conservation economically, you give the farmer the ability to do that. And then you end up increasing, at the end of the day, I think it was $40 per acre increase, something like that, or $20, $30 per acre increase in profitability under that scenario. So just to review, we've got the conservation concerns, we've got the economic concerns, the opportunities, and remember, precision ag is the overlap between those conservation opportunities and those economic opportunities that addresses both the conservation concerns and the economic concerns. That overlap is how we can use this technology to make smart decisions on the landscape. So in the time I have left, I'm going to give you a quick case study. This data right here is currently under review at Journal of Precision Agriculture. And this was in the Blackland Prairie region of Mississippi. And we had 52 fields, and we ran through 3 different scenarios on the study farm. We ran all fields under 100% crop production, then under 100% conservation enrollment, and then under what we call targeted conservation enrollment. Targeted conservation enrollment is only enrolling a conservation practice where it is economically beneficial to the landowner. Okay, so only enrolling conservation where it's economically beneficial. And we did this, we picked popular practices in the region, which were CP42, which is a pollinator practice, CP33, which is the bobwhite buffer practice, and CP22, which is forested riparian buffers. So the way it works is you take a field, and panel 1 here is the profit surface under production. Whatever the yield data the farmer gave us, the input cost he gave us, the crop price he told us to simulate, and this is what the profit surface is like. Granted, this field is profitable, but it's got some severe profit reductions near the field edge, not uncommon. Panel 2 shows you all the parts of that field, that boundary is where it's more profitable to enroll conservation. That's the targeted outline. Panel 3 is profitability under max CP33 enrollment. So in this case, put a 120-foot buffer around it and see what happens. This is, like I said, it went from red to orange. It didn't go to green, but if you look at the scale here, he's still making some money there, just not as much as the green because the yield was so high in the middle. And then panel 4 is the reflection of panel number 2. It's actually taking that targeted buffer, smoothing it out, making it something farmable, and running the analysis and looking at profitability under that scenario. So we did this across 52 fields. We had 4 years of yield data for most of the fields, 3 for some, 2 for some. And we ran these scenarios across all the fields and looked at what the results were going to be across all 52 fields. So on that y-axis here, you've got average profit of field profitability per hectare. And then the first panel is original profitability, that's farming. Number 2 is maximum conservation, maxing out the conservation practice regardless of profit. And number 3, the one on the far right, is targeted conservation, only enrolling conservation where it's profitable. And across our study, about 71% of the fields were more profitable under targeted conservation. There were some fields that we had no opportunities for conservation. They were just beautifully well-managed fields that were super profitable. But across the data set, when you use maximum conservation, you actually can decrease revenue, profitability, because when you're maxing it out, sometimes you're getting into really good productive ground. When you use targeted conservation, you actually can exceed both maximum conservation profitability and original profitability because you're taking out the least profitable field acres and enrolling them in a government program that's going to give you a guaranteed payment every year. So if you take all the different fields we had in our analysis and you put a histogram of profit per acre of each cell across the analysis, the gray histogram is the row crop agriculture before we did anything. The green histogram is overlaid as the targeted conservation. So what we've done is we've shifted the profitability distribution of all the cells in that field to the right to get most of the acreage. Some of the unprofitable acreage wasn't eligible for anything, so we couldn't do anything with it. We've shifted the distribution of profitability to the right to make sure there are very few unprofitable acres. Okay. Now, when you look at the degree of profitable increase in this analysis, it varies widely. It varies from 1% to 250+%, right? And that's an important thing to know because not every field that's more profitable is really all that more profitable, right? There's some variability in there. So we show this graph to illustrate if I'm working with a farmer on this and I plot this kind of map, I'm gonna say, hey, let's start with the field on the right and let's work our way to the left until you get to a threshold where you're not willing to make a change because it's not a guaranteed return enough, right? Some farmers aren't going to take land out of production for a $10 per acre change. Some are. Some are going to need more than that. But it's important to know that it's highly variable how this works. Some fields are really more profitable under this scenario. Some are less. We also looked at the impact of yield data in our analysis, and we looked at average profit increase of fields where we had 1 year of yield data versus field where we had 4. You know, a lot of variability in there. The confidence intervals kind of overlap. Not a huge difference, but we encourage landowners to work with as much yield data as possible, so we're accounting for as much temporal variability in that cropping system. Now, let's talk a little bit about how this technology can influence future conservation. Yield data can be challenging to get. Sometimes a farmer doesn't have it. Sometimes he's got a custom combine operator that's got it. We're trying to get away from reliance on the yield data specifically, and there's an expanding field of research using remote sensing technology and some others to actually map yield variability. So there's a lot of models out there that currently do this for you, and they're fairly complex and computationally intensive to use remote sensing to make these things. So what we're trying to do is an easier way that state agencies, NGOs, private consultants can do, not have to go through this overly computationally intensive approach to actually map yield variability across a field. And there's been a lot of interesting research. This is a paper that came out a few years ago looking at remote sensing and comparing remote sensing NDVI data, which is the normalized difference vegetation index, which measures plant reflectives, with grain yield. And they're seeing not great relationships, R squared to 0.48, but then again, it's also over a large landscape, so there's a lot of variability, but they're using these predictive equations to identify field areas that are less profitable, or less, in this case, was less yield. This was a really interesting paper they did in Australia. So we're adopting some of this to move forward with it, just to show you another example of how this technology can be approached. And what we can do with this is say, look, where in this landscape if I'm going to send a private lands biologist or a farm bill biologist with pheasants forever, I'm going to send them out and do a landscape in their district. Hey, which of the farms that you need to maybe spend the most time on, or which of the farmer biologist relationships that we need to cultivate the most because there's the greatest opportunity for conservation and profitability in that region. We're also taking this to larger spatial scales, and we're looking at mapping how variable yield or profitability is, and then overlaying it with things like the Bob White ranking index that NVCI put in several years ago, which ranks potential for Bob White restoration in different landscapes. I've got a graduate student working on this now in Mississippi. And what we do is we take the areas that are high, medium, low for Bob White potential restoration, and we overlay them with maps that say, hey, yield variability is high, medium, low. So we're doing this at a larger spatial scale, so moving from the field level to the landscape level and saying, okay, where are we going to put our ground personnel to focus on where the most potential, in this case Bob White, but it could be for any species, the most potential for Bob White restoration, coupled with the most potential for the financial benefits of the farmer, so they're happier about the conservation moment, and therefore more willing to take land out of production. And when you zoom into these areas, there's a great deal of overlap. Blue here being high potential for Bob White restoration, red being really highly vulnerable, highly variable productive soils. There's a lot of red in here, overlapping blue, that would be a good place to send a farm bill biologist to go develop some relationships. And you can see it varies across the state. Lastly, we've got to link these economic outcomes to wildlife outcomes, and this has been something that's been challenging in our field, but the models are getting much better. This is a great research out of Joe Fontaine's lab a couple years ago that kind of developed a decision support tool to look at how pheasant abundance could be increased, or how pheasant habitat suitability could be increased as you change different metrics in a township. So they've got this slide rule where you can actually, how much of the percent of the acreage is in row crops, how much is in CRP, how much is in small grains and pastures, and then you can use that, and the map will actually change as for habitat suitability as you adjust those parameters, and linking something like what we're doing to, hey, how would monarchs, or how would Bob Whites, or how would Dick Sissels respond to these changes is kind of the next step we're trying to go. So precision agriculture is not a huge, it's not widely accepted in our program, in our field yet. There's a few people in the country doing it in a wildlife context. But if you're still on the fence about precision agriculture, I think at the end of this talk, hopefully we can agree that there is a way over it. Some people in our field hop over it faster than others. Some are going to be a little bit slower, and that's fine. And some of you are going to get really innovative and improvise and find a way to get into this, hopefully. But at the end of the day, let's remember, there's only one thing you get from sitting on a fence, and that's splinters. And the reason I bring that up is the wildlife community, I don't want the wildlife community to be the laggards on the adoption of this technology. There's always going to be some innovators and some laggards, but we've got to ask ourselves, if we believe this technology has potential, where along this distribution is our profession going to fall? The soil people have already adopted it, the water quality people have already adopted it, and the wildlife community is poised, I think now, we've put out a number of publications illustrating how this can happen. I think the wildlife community is poised now to start being, at least in the late majority or early majority, as this technology increases opportunities for us to make differences on the landscape. And with that, I will take any questions.